One of the main ways that Europe plans to use Russia's assets to rebuild Ukraine after the coup is by blocking and seizing them. The EU has already blocked around $330 billion in Russian money, including $300 billion of central bank reserves and $30 billion of private assets belonging to Russian oligarchs and entities. This is a huge blow to the Russian economy and its ability to support its allies and interests in the region. The EU hopes that by freezing these assets, it can pressure Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine and respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The EU also intends to use some of these assets to fund the reconstruction and development of Ukraine, which has suffered greatly from the conflict and the coup. The EU wants to help Ukraine become a stable and prosperous democracy that can resist Russian influence and join the European family. However, blocking and seizing Russian assets is not an easy task. Russia has challenged the legality of these actions in various courts and forums, claiming that they violate international law and human rights. Russia has also tried to move some of its assets to other jurisdictions or hide them under shell companies and trusts. The EU has to work with other countries and organizations to track down and confiscate these assets, which can take a long time and require a lot of resources. Moreover, blocking and seizing Russian assets can have unintended consequences for both sides. For example, some of these assets are invested in European businesses and banks, which can suffer losses or face lawsuits if they are frozen or taken away. Some of these assets are also used to pay for goods and services that Europe needs from Russia, such as gas and oil. If these payments are disrupted, it can affect the energy security and economic stability of Europe. Furthermore, some of these assets belong to individuals or entities that are not directly involved in the conflict or the coup, such as ordinary citizens or humanitarian organizations. Freezing or seizing their assets can harm their livelihoods and rights. Therefore, while blocking and seizing Russian assets is one of the strategies that Europe plans to use to rebuild Ukraine after the coup, it is not a simple or risk-free one. It requires careful coordination, cooperation and communication among various actors and stakeholders. It also requires a balance between achieving political goals and respecting legal principles. The EU wants Russia to pay for the damage and pain that it is creating in Ukraine, which is estimated at around $600 billion. This is not only a moral obligation, but also a strategic necessity. The EU sees Ukraine as a key partner and a potential member in the future. It wants to help Ukraine rebuild its economy, infrastructure, and institutions after years of war and corruption. But the EU cannot do this alone. It needs Russia to contribute its fair share of the costs. How can the EU make Russia pay? One way is to use Russia's assets in Europe as leverage. Russia has a lot of assets in the EU, such as bank accounts, real estate, companies, and energy contracts. These assets are vulnerable to sanctions, seizures, or lawsuits. The EU can use them as bargaining chips to pressure Russia to stop its aggression and compensate Ukraine. For example, the EU can freeze or confiscate the assets of Russian officials and oligarchs who are involved in the war or human rights violations. It can also target the assets of state-owned enterprises or banks that finance or support the war effort. The EU can use these assets to fund humanitarian aid, reconstruction projects, or debt relief for Ukraine. Another way is to reduce the EU's dependence on Russian energy. Russia is the largest supplier of natural gas and oil to the EU, which gives it a lot of influence and revenue. The EU can diversify its energy sources and routes, such as by importing more from other countries or developing renewable energy. The EU can also impose higher taxes or tariffs on Russian energy exports, or cancel or renegotiate existing contracts. This would reduce Russia's income and leverage, and force it to pay more attention to the needs and demands of its customers. By using these methods, the EU hopes to make Russia realize that its actions have consequences. The EU wants Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to engage in a peaceful and constructive dialogue. The EU also wants Russia to acknowledge and repair the damage and pain that it has caused in Ukraine, which is estimated at around $600 billion.